Welcome back to the FIDE women's candidates. We are in round 6, and the race for the top is razor-thin. Anna Muzychuk sits alone at 4 points, but a massive pack of 5 players, Divya Desmukh, Vaishali Rameshbabu, Alexandra Goryechkina, Kateryna Lagno, and Georgina, are all breathing down her neck at 3 points each. Every game today could completely reshape the standings. One slip, one brilliant idea, and the whole tournament picture changes. The game we are reviewing today features 2 of those chasers in direct combat. Kateryna Lagno is one of the most experienced players in this field, a former world blitz champion known for sharp, tactical battles. Vaishali Rameshbabu is the young Indian star who has been steadily climbing the world rankings, playing dynamic, aggressive chess in the style of her brother Pragnanda. Both players came into this game on 3 points, meaning a win here was absolutely critical to staying in contention with Muzychuk. The bishop's opening with the Vienna hybrid is a flexible and slightly offbeat choice at the top level. White develops the bishop to c4 early, aiming for rapid piece activity and keeping options open for both the Vienna game and the Italian. Players like Anand and Carlsen have used similar hybrid systems to sidestep heavy theory. The resulting positions tend to be rich in strategic content, with both sides fighting for the center and piece activity rather than sharp theoretical lines. White opens with the king's pawn, staking a claim in the center and inviting open game positions where piece activity and tactics often decide the outcome. Black mirrors in the center with the symmetric response, the classical foundation of open games going back centuries. This immediately contests control and opens lines for both bishops. White chooses the bishop's opening, pointing the bishop directly at the sensitive f7 square. This move avoids the heavily theoretical Ruy Lopez and often transposes into Vienna or Italian structures depending on Black's response. Black develops the knight to f6 immediately, attacking the e4 pawn and following sound opening principles. This move also signals that Black is ready for a fighting game rather than a passive setup. White reinforces the e4 pawn with the knight, steering the game into Vienna territory. This flexible developing move also prepares future options like a pawn push to d4 or f4. Black develops the queen's knight, adding more pressure on e4 and following classical development. The position now has the look of a Vienna game with the bishop already on c4. White opts for a slower, more solid approach with d3, choosing a King's Indian attack style setup rather than the aggressive d4 break. This signals a long strategic battle rather than an early tactical skirmish. Black pins the knight on c3, a thematic idea borrowed from the Ruy Lopez. By pressuring c3, Black hopes to either exchange the bishop for the knight or force White to accept a structural concession. White develops the king's knight to f3, maintaining the tension without resolving the pin immediately. The knight eyes the e5 pawn and supports the center. Black plays a prophylactic pawn nudge, preventing any knight or bishop from landing on g5. This small but useful move keeps Black's position flexible before committing further. White castles kingside, tucking the king away to safety and connecting the rooks, with the bishop still on c4. White retains pressure on the f7 diagonal. Black executes the bishop exchange, giving up the bishop pair to double White's c-pawns. This is a strategic decision typical of Ruy Lopez-style play, trading long-term bishop power for structural damage. White recaptures toward the center, accepting the doubled c-pawns but gaining a half-open b-file and maintaining a solid pawn presence. The bishop pair and pawn structure will be key strategic factors going forward. Black castles kingside as well, reaching a balanced middle game where both sides must formulate a plan around the pawn structure. White places the rook on the central e-file, supporting the e4 pawn and preparing possible central action. A natural and sensible rook activation. Black solidifies the center with d6, giving the e5 pawn a firm base. This creates a classic closed center where both sides will maneuver for piece activity on the wings. White plays a useful waiting move, preventing any backrank tricks and giving the king a little air. It also stops a potential bishop sortie to g4. Black reroutes the knight toward the c4 bishop, a standard maneuver in these structures. The knight on a5 eyes the bishop and threatens to exchange it, relieving one of White's active pieces. White retreats the bishop to b3, keeping it on the long diagonal and out of reach of the knight. The bishop remains a strong piece pointing toward the kingside. Black advances the queenside pawn, claiming space and cementing the knight on a5. This pawn also prepares a potential queenside expansion. White locks the queenside with c4, fixing the pawn chain and preventing Black's knight from easily returning via c4 or b3. The position begins to take on a closed character. Black retreats the knight to h7 with a plan in mind, likely preparing an f5 pawn break to open the kingside. The knight is temporarily offside but has a purpose. White reinforces the pawn chain with c3, creating a solid base in the center. The structure is becoming more rigid, and both sides must look for dynamic play to break through. And here it is, Black launches the kingside attack with f5, the logical follow-up to the knight retreat. This pawn thrust opens lines against White's king and signals Black's aggressive intentions. White captures the pawn, opening the e-file further and releasing the central tension. Trading here avoids a cramped position but gives Black more scope for piece activity. Black recaptures with the bishop, placing it on an active diagonal pointing toward the queen side. The bishop on f5 is a powerful piece in this structure. White finally strikes in the center with d4, trying to create counterplay and open lines for the pieces. This is a critical moment where the game begins to open up. Black advances the e-pawn, gaining space and shutting out the knight on f3. The pawn on e4 is a powerful wedge deep in White's position. White retreats the knight to h2, stepping out of the way of the advancing e-pawn and preparing to reroute. The knight will look to come back via f1 or g4. Black shores up the queenside with b6, giving the knight on a5 a potential retreat and reinforcing the pawn chain. A useful consolidating move. White activates the queen aggressively to h5, immediately eyeing the h6 pawn and creating threats against Black's kingside. This is an ambitious piece of play, looking to generate counterattacking chances. Black responds by bringing the queen to f6, both defending the h6 pawn and countering with pressure along the f-file. The queens eye each other across the board. White activates the bishop to e3, adding a defender to the d4 pawn and connecting the rooks, a logical developing move in a complex position. Black swings the rook to e8, piling pressure on the e-file and supporting the e4 pawn. The rook is immediately useful, eyeing White's back rank. White places the rook on d1, supporting the d4 pawn and preparing to push it forward. However, the engine sees this as a slight misstep. As Black's position is becoming very active, Black repositions the bishop to e6, stepping off the f5 square and preparing to coordinate the pieces more actively. The bishop on e6 eyes the b3 bishop across the board. White retreats the queen to e2, and this is where the engine flags a serious evaluation swing of a full pawn in Black's favor. The queen on e2 looks passive, and Black's powerful pawn on e4 and active pieces give real long-term pressure that White is struggling to address. Black moves the queen to f7, and the engine actually marks this as a mistake, swinging the evaluation back significantly toward White. The queen was more active on f6, and this retreat gives White a chance to breathe. The f7 square is not as threatening, and Black misses a chance to press harder. White advances the d-pawn to d5, pushing back the bishop on e6 and trying to claim central space. This pawn lunge aims to complicate the position. The bishop retreats all the way back to c8, and the engine penalizes this as a mistake. The bishop gives up its active role, and Black's coordination suffers. A more aggressive square was available to keep the pressure on. White attacks the knight on a5 with the bishop, trying to win time and force concessions on the queen side. This creates an immediate problem for Black to solve. Black places the rook on e7, and this too is flagged as a mistake. The rook is not doing much on e7, and the engine indicates Black had stronger options to maintain the initiative. The position is becoming harder for Black to navigate. White reroutes the knight from h2 to f1, beginning a journey toward more active squares. The knight heads toward e3 or g3 to join the fight. Black pushes h5, an important pawn advance that grabs kingside space and prepares to activate the knight on h7. The engine sees this as a significant improvement in Black's position, recovering a full pawn in evaluation. White continues rerouting the knight toward the center via d2. The piece maneuver is logical, but costs time that Black is using to build kingside pressure. Black brings the queen back to f6, a much more aggressive square than f7. Notice how this immediately creates pressure. The queen on f6 coordinates with the rook on e7 and the advancing h-pawn, and the engine swings to Black's favor by almost a full pawn. White repositions the rook to c1, and the engine notes this as a significant moment where White recovers some ground, swinging the evaluation back toward equality. The rook is better placed here to support the queenside pawns. Black shifts the queen to h4, an aggressive outpost where it eyes the h3 pawn and coordinates with the pawn on h5. The queen is becoming a dangerous attacker. White retreats the bishop to c2. Getting out of the way and preserving the piece, the bishop will look to support the center or come to d3 to challenge the e4 pawn. Black reactivates the bishop to f5, an excellent square where it points toward the queen side and supports the e4 pawn from behind. The pieces are beginning to coordinate beautifully. White jumps the knight to b3, and this is the decisive mistake of the game. The engine swings by nearly 2 full pawns in black's favor. The knight on b3 attacks the a5 knight but leaves serious tactical vulnerabilities in white's position. The pieces on the king side are no longer coordinating, and black immediately finds a strong response. Black retreats the knight to b7, but the engine marks this as an equally large mistake in the other direction, letting white off the hook. The knight on b7 looks passive, and the swing back is nearly 2 full pawns. Black had a much more forceful continuation available here and misses the chance to take a decisive advantage. White retreats the bishop to d1, trying to reorganize the pieces. The engine notes this loses around half a pawn in evaluation, but the position remains complicated with mutual mistakes still being made. Black plays g6, stabilizing the kingside pawn structure and giving the king a little room. This also prepares to activate the knight on h7 via f6 or f8. White lashes out with a 4, trying to create queenside counterplay and challenge the knight on a 5 once more. The engine, however, judges this as a significant error, losing over a pawn in evaluation. The queenside push weakens white's structure at a critical moment. Black responds by centralizing the rook to e5, and the engine flags this as a mistake in return, giving back some of the advantage. A rook on e5 is not as active as it might appear, and a more direct approach was available. White plays the queen to d2, trying to coordinate the pieces and possibly support the d5 pawn. The engine sees this as losing another significant chunk of evaluation, as the queen is not well placed here. Black sacrifices the bishop on h3, and the engine marks this as a serious mistake with a swing of over 3 pawns. Black is giving material to create attacking chances, but the sacrifice is not objectively sound. The tension in the position had been mounting, and both players are now navigating complications under pressure. White hits back with the bishop to h6, attacking the rook on f8 and trying to create counterplay. The engine confirms White's position has stabilized somewhat after the incorrect sacrifice. Black moves the rook to f7, and this is another mistake according to the engine. With a swing of nearly 3 pawns, the rook gives up the f8 square unnecessarily, and White had resources to exploit this. White brings the rook to e3, centralizing it and reinforcing the defense. The rook on e3 supports the third rank and prepares to meet Black's threats. Black activates the bishop to g4, and once again the engine identifies this as a mistake with a swing of nearly 3 pawns. The bishop on g4 appears active but leaves weaknesses elsewhere that White can exploit. White retreats the bishop to c2, keeping it active along the long diagonal and preparing to meet Black's threats calmly. Black pushes the bishop to f3, and this move causes a massive evaluation swing of 4 full pawns in Black's favor. The bishop on f3 is threatening to wreak havoc, and if White cannot deal with it properly, the attack becomes overwhelming. White captures the bishop with the g-pawn, forced to take it, but this opens the g-file toward the white king and creates a dangerous passed pawn on f3 after the recapture. Black recaptures with the e-pawn, and the engine sees this as a massive mistake with a swing of 6 full pawns. By taking with the pawn rather than a piece, Black creates a passed pawn on f3 but allows White defensive resources that should have been avoided. The game has become incredibly chaotic. White centralizes the queen to d3, pressing on both the kingside and preparing to use the rook on e3 to challenge the f3 pawn. White is fighting back in a position that has swung wildly. Black doubles the rooks on the f-file with this move, and the evaluation swings back toward Black. The pressure on f2 and the coordination of both rooks creates serious threats against White's king. White captures the f3 pawn with the rook, removing the immediate threat. The engine confirms White's position has improved considerably, swinging to nearly 3 pawns in White's favor. Black plays the knight to g5, activating it aggressively, but this is a very serious mistake with a swing of over 5 pawns in White's favor. The knight on g5 looks threatening, but exposes Black to tactical refutations that White can now exploit. White captures the knight on g5, but the engine judges this as a mistake, giving back 1.5 pawns of advantage. There was a much stronger continuation available that would have maintained a decisive edge. Black recaptures with check on g5, and the engine flags this too as a mistake, swinging over 2.5 pawns. The game continues to oscillate wildly, as both players find it difficult to identify the best moves in this extraordinarily complex position. White blocks the check with the rook on g3, a logical defensive move that also contests the g-file. Black infiltrates with the queen to h3, and this is flagged as another mistake with a swing of over 3 pawns in White's favor. The queen on h3 appears threatening, but White has a resource to meet it decisively. White plays the queen to f1, but this is the single biggest blunder of the entire game, a catastrophic mistake with a swing of nearly 6 full pawns. White had a winning continuation available and instead chooses a passive defensive move that allows Black to take over completely. This is the turning point of the game. Black immediately capitalizes with the rook sacrifice on g3, and the engine confirms this is a winning blow, swinging over 9 full pawns in Black's favor. The rook smashes through, and the White king is suddenly in mortal danger. White is forced to recapture with the pawn, opening the g-file completely. The White king on g1 is now exposed with no shelter. Black takes on g3 with check, and the engine registers this as another winning move in a winning position. Black has a queen on g3 and a rook on g5, creating a devastating mating net. White tries to block with the queen, but there is no stopping Black's attack at this point. Black checks again with the queen to e3, keeping the pressure relentless and driving the White king further into danger. White steps to h2, the only available square, but the king is walking into a mating net. Black brings the rook to g5, adding another attacker to the assault on the White king. The evaluation has now swung to over 10 pawns in Black's favor. This is completely winning. White plays the queen to h3, trying to create counterplay or at least delay the inevitable. Black checks on f4, and the evaluation keeps climbing past 10 pawns in Black's favor. White's king is being hunted across the board. White retreats to h1, the only move, but the king has nowhere to hide. Black's rook swings to g3, threatening to deliver mate, and the engine shows the evaluation is now past 11 pawns in Black's favor. The position is completely hopeless for White. White tries a desperate check with the queen to e6, attempting to generate some counterplay and perhaps force the Black king to move. The Black king steps to g7, calmly walking away from the check. The evaluation continues to climb past 12 pawns in Black's favor. White continues checking desperately with the queen to e7, trying to prolong the game and hope for a miracle. The Black king walks to h6, completely unafraid, and the attack on the White king is now overwhelming. The evaluation has climbed to over 13 pawns in Black's favor. White activates the bishop to e4, trying one last desperate attempt to generate threats. The engine gives White a small recovery here, dropping the swing back under 1 pawn, but the position remains completely lost. Black repositions the rook to g5, and the evaluation surges past 12 pawns in Black's favor again. The rook on g5 supports the attack perfectly, and there is no way for White to defend. White retreats the bishop to g2, and the engine penalizes this with a further evaluation drop of over 1 pawn. White is simply running out of useful moves. Black delivers the final check on h4, and the engine registers the highest swing of the game, nearly 16 full pawns in Black's favor. White resigns here, as there is no escape from the mating attack. A stunning finish by Vaishali after an incredibly complex and double-edged battle. What ultimately decided this game was White's critical queen retreat to f1 on move 38, which handed Black the initiative in a position where White had genuine winning chances. From that moment, Vaishali's rook sacrifice on g3 tore open the White king, and the resulting attack was unstoppable. The game was a wild tactical battle full of mutual mistakes, but in the end, it was Lagno's defensive collapse under time pressure that proved fatal. A wild and dramatic game in round 6 of the FIDE women's candidates, with Vaishali picking up a crucial victory to join the chasing pack. The standings are still incredibly tight, with Muzichuk at the top but the chasers closing in fast. Round 7 promises even more fireworks. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this game, and make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single move.